Okay, I think we're at 3:30, so welcome everyone. Good afternoon and good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to our last session in the COVID's impact on assessments, the NCME webinar series that we started about 10 weeks ago. And we're at our last but not least webinar where we're gonna take a look at the assessments in the near and far future. So before we dive into the webinars, I do want to acknowledge our planning committee who helped put the webinar series together. Susan Davis-Becker, Alan Ford, Marianne Perry, and myself. We've worked pretty hard to put the webinar series together and help facilitate it. I hope all of you were able to enjoy the sessions. We've averaged about 300 attendees per session, so very, very great turnout. Thanks to all of you who have been attending our webinars as your schedule allows. And I hope our biggest hope for these, besides the professional development, besides us being able to get together as a community to be able to talk about measurement issues, we're also hoping as people are dealing with all the technical issues because of COVID and its impact on assessments, our discussions and our shared thoughts would be able to guide some of the practitioners as they embrace this challenge in the spring, in the summer this year. So hopefully we are able to at least get people thinking about some of the important issues as they dive into how they will be dealing with the assessment and the associated technical side of things. We are very grateful for all the interest in attending our sessions. We were able to open this up to people who are not NCME members as well, because we wanted to share the knowledge and expertise with a larger audience. So if you're not an NCME member currently, if you have been enjoying our webinars and think this is a good community for you to be part of, please feel free to join us, join and become an NCME member. The other thing I'll put in is our conference this year. Obviously, it's going to be a virtual conference in June. We would rather to be in person, but now that we have to do it in a digital format, we're really embracing it. And frankly, it's actually the accessibility part of it. It's actually the silver lining in all this craziness from the pandemic. We are going to be able to reach a much larger audience potentially. So if you have not registered for our conference, please go ahead and register. It is much more affordable as well this year compared to what we're able to do in the past years because of the virtual format. We will be pushing out a survey today during the webinar. Please do respond and provide your thoughts around your reactions from the webinar series, as well as any suggestions you may have for NCME. So please take a moment to respond. I promise it won't take too much of your time. And last but not least, we're going to close out our webinar series with a happy hour today. So if you saw the announcement from earlier this morning, after the webinar concludes about 5 o'clock Eastern time today, we'll have about a 15-minute break. Go get whatever beverages of your choice and come back and join us for a happy hour. We'll try to break people into small breakout groups so it's a little bit more manageable. We can get more voices heard. So hopefully you'll be able to join us for that as well. So let's go into our exciting webinar where we're going to take a look at the future of assessment. I want to take a moment to introduce all the panelists and myself, facilitator for this meeting. I guess I didn't really say who I am. My name is Ye Cheng. I am the NCME president. In my real job, I am the vice president of psychometrics and research services with Pearson. I am a practitioner. In my role, I oversee all of our psychometric services and products in both the K-12 space as well as licensure certification space. Next, we're going to go to Jennifer.
Hi all, I'm Jennifer Randall. Thrilled to be here today. I'm an associate professor in the Research Educational Measurement and Psychometrics program at UMass. Go UMass. I will turn it over to Lori.
Lori Shepard here, very grateful to have been invited. I'm a distinguished professor at the University of Colorado Boulder. I listed some of my research interests over many decades, and I thought you would be amused in this community to know that I was the president of NCME from 1982 to 83. So a long time ago. Glad to be here.
And Andrew.
Hi, everybody. I'm Andrew Ho. I'm on the faculty at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and I am proud to be a member of the NCME board in my last year serving that role. Thank you again, and to the planning committee for this wonderful series. As I put into the chat, it's just been wonderful to feel this community grow and cohere to support each other through these tough times.
Thank you, everyone. Just to give you all an overview of the session, we have met, all four of us, and as we've been discussing about the future for assessment and some of our history too, we've decided to really craft this session to discuss the future for assessments from the perspectives of equity and racial justice. So each of the panelists have prepared a presentation, and all of them have agreed to talk about three different types of assessment: accountability, selection, and classroom testing. We also have some additional questions, and of course, don't be shy. I don't think people have been shy in the past, and certainly not today. Also put your questions in the chats, and I'll be monitoring that and be feeding those questions to our distinguished panelists today. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Jennifer.
Jennifer, you're on mute.
Thank you, Andrew. I'll start over. I want to spend a little time today to talk to you about justice, racial justice specifically, including what I think are the critical components necessary to achieve it in assessment, and then what it looks like, of course, in classroom accountability and selection assessment. A justice-oriented approach to assessment rejects a utilitarian theory of greatest good in favor of a theory that rests on equal rights and the notion that equality of opportunity should be to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society. Such a theory of justice requires that we think morally about how we develop and use assessments so that they do not further marginalize those who've already been marginalized. I find this modification of an epidemiology figure helpful in thinking about what the road to racial justice looks like, specifically in assessment and measurement. Indeed, if we can agree that white supremacy and injustice are diseases, then this model is particularly useful. I argue that racial justice and assessment can be achieved through the integration of culturally sustaining and anti-racist assessments. And in doing so, justice is made possible while simultaneously driving out or just leaving no room for white supremacist, white-centered practices. Culturally sustaining assessments, really an extension of culturally sustaining pedagogy, and you can see Paris's really popular book here, seek to use assessment tools as a way to sustain. And more recently, I've heard the term revitalize when referring to indigenous communities, the life ways of historically marginalized communities. And whiteness is not placed as the default center of the assessment design process. Anti-racist assessment, on the other hand, is an extension of culturally sustaining assessment as it seeks to disrupt racist systems of oppression. An anti-racist framework for small and large-scale assessment must always critically question the structures and assumptions that make up the judgment of all assessment developers. It is explicit about its politics and its intent to reconstruct hierarchical racial power arrangements that have been historically produced or reproduced via assessments. Anti-racist assessment is political, as it actively seeks to change current racist oppressive narratives, often reified by assessments. It is not enough for our assessments to be not racist. That's just not a thing. They have to be explicitly anti-racist if justice is the ultimate goal. So when I talk today, you'll probably hear me refer to whiteness repeatedly. So I wanted to just take a moment and explicate what I mean by that term, because I do not mean white people. Whiteness is a quality derived from and against those others whom it sets apart as anti-individual and always race. Whiteness is fundamentally a relational concept rather than something that resides inside an individual or a group. To be sure, whiteness maintains its preferred status by masquerading as invisible, as objective, and or neutral. And by doing so, is able to maintain this neutral appearance through coded discourses of race. And when we do this, white privilege goes unacknowledged. Broadly speaking, whiteness operates as an essential quality of humanity, a quality that simply is not available to most of us, declaring non-racial ways of knowing and understanding that have been both created and preserved by the white dominant class. It is through this white hegemony that current approaches to assessment development reside and serve to prevent even the consideration of other practices and standards. I want to remind people that what I'm talking about here goes beyond equity and access. Issues of injustice are not to be resolved in assessment by increasing access to whiteness to minoritized students. And I want to say that again for the people in the back. Issues of injustice are not to be resolved in assessment by increasing access to whiteness to minoritized students. That approach is rooted in deficit models of thinking about minoritized populations, and it fails to acknowledge the inherent value in what they bring or what they could bring to this table. So now I'm going to turn to discussing justice, or what I say, the road to justice, because it will require us as a field to commit to embarking on a really long, winding journey with a crap load of roadside breakdowns. And I will discuss justice with respect to classroom assessment, accountability testing, and selection testing. But within all three of these assessment systems, I believe we can and should ask ourselves questions as they relate to the purpose of the assessment, and that we must articulate explicitly to all stakeholders a commitment to justice in our assessment practices. Our positionality, which requires each of us to constantly be in reflection about our own assumptions about race and identity. When I refer to people and places, I could also use the word community, but it's critical for us to understand in a real and a very deep way who is being assessed and what is being valued in that community. And can we name those groups who hold the power with the assessment, regardless of the type of assessment, and who is being privileged by that assessment? And what about our processes and procedures for assessment development? And did these procedures center justice, meaning were cultural sustainability and anti-racism centered during every stage of that process? Not just at the end with sensitivity reviews and diff analyses. And of course, we must consider the consequences. Who is harmed? And more importantly, how can that harm be undone? So I would encourage classroom teachers, including those of us who teach future measurement professionals, to ask ourselves these questions. Am I engaging students in ongoing discussions about the assessment process and the role race has historically played in assessment? What racial identity am I bringing to my teaching and my assessment? And what histories and values inform that identity? What assumptions do I possess about my students, about their language, about their knowledge making, about their understandings, their values? And how have I engaged these students in this same reflective process? Because the accountability assessment development process begins with the articulation of the construct to be assessed, so must the journey towards racial justice in our field, with an approach to construct definition and representation that is culturally sustaining and anti-racist. It's really important for us to move away, and I mean move quickly away, like yesterday away, from color avoidant approaches to construct definition. This approach only benefits the dominant power structures, refer back to my previous slide on whiteness, and represents a different kind of post-civil rights era racism, aiding in the maintenance of white privilege without any fanfare. If we're to move towards being a justice-oriented profession, producing justice-oriented accountability assessments, then we have to be aggressive in our support of assessment development processes that explicitly value BIPOC students, in the same way that we have been historically aggressive in our support of assessment processes that explicitly valued and privileged whiteness. Doing so requires at a minimum re-envisioning our construct definition and the content domain in a way that decenters whiteness and acknowledges the ways of knowing and understanding associated with minoritized individuals as construct critical. We should be asking these questions around positionality, power, and processes. What are the sociocultural and racial context, resources, hopes, dispositions, experiences, and backgrounds of the stakeholders? Who was in the room as the construct is being defined, and who was excluded or not present in that room? How are the different ways of knowing and constructing knowledge and understanding being brought into the test design process to sustain students' identities? Who is being rejected, whose identity is being rejected or devalued through the way the construct is being defined? Have we used this assessment to attempt to disrupt any imbalances in power? And can we leverage new technologies to allow for a more inclusive construct representation? And I look to the work around translanguaging as an example of that. And finally, when considering selection testing, I would say repeat everything I just said thus far, and then also ask ourselves, have we considered the anticipated, intended, unintended, immediate, and long-term consequences of the decisions we have made? And as an aside, were those decisions rooted in a justice orientation? Have ways of knowing beyond those of westernized democracies, for example, been thoroughly investigated and accounted for in the assessment? Has the construct and the content domain been designed in such a way that is intrinsically easier for whiteness or white individuals than BIPOC individuals? And of course, how stable is that construct being assessed across social, cultural, and racial context? So now I want to thank you for listening to my thoughts or my musings, and I'm going to turn things over to Lori.
Thank you. Sorry, I can't hear or see you now, so I hope everything is still there.
Lori,
yes.
we're not seeing your screen.
You're not seeing anything. Well, then that is bad because I've completely, it's taken over both of my screens. So Erin, I guess I'm gonna have to ask you to do it. Or here, let me try this one.
Or I'm happy to share it too, if you want me to.
Yeah, sorry. I was worried about this. Okay.
Let me share.
Thank you, please.
Yep.
Andrew's laughing at me. I'm so sorry.
No, I'm just remarking on your prescience because you said exactly this would happen, and sure enough, it did. So.
Yeah. Well, it's worked before, but it wasn't working 15 minutes ago. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, I'll share.
Please.
I'm having some difficulty myself, of course.
Well, then I will try it one more time. It's because I will try to explain it, but I won't be able to here.
Oh, we're seeing our screen now.
There you go.
It worked.
Well, I don't quite understand because I thought I did the exact same thing. But now the difference is I can still see at least Andrew, Jennifer, and Yi. So thank you. That's much better. I appreciate being asked, and I wanted some acknowledgements that I reminded myself to think of on this first slide. I want to thank you for the series, Yi, and for this particular invitation, because I think this is a very special conversation to be invited to. Steve Cerisi ought to be acknowledged as someone who's raised some of these issues very recently, but in thinking about it, I also want to note that Sam Messick and Lee Kronbach back in the 80s were asking these questions, and my colleague Bob Lynn, who just had a way of asking questions about the impact of our testing, not just the technical adequacy of the instruments we were conceiving. And also on these issues of racialized aspects of testing, I want to acknowledge Ed Gordon, who turns 100 this summer. He'll be celebrated in a special event, and Asa Hilliard. So to this question about the future of testing and what it means to take up some of the things that Jennifer was just trying to help us understand. I think most of the members of our community are willing in courses we teach our students, for example, to say that testing has a racialized history. But I don't think that we acknowledge fully and deeply how much it is still enacting structural racism. The use of tests has impacts over and over again. So the thinking of white supremacy is enabled when we use words about achievement gaps that eventually help to identify over and over again segregated schools as inadequate. That takes on a supremacist viewpoint and enables it. We have to think about how much we are contributing to that when we engage. And now most recently, and you've heard the critics, we need to listen to them, that as soon as you have this new terminology, learning loss, think about how it is applied over and over again to Black and Brown children, seemingly to help, but in fact also perpetuating a narrative. And then I've listed a number of the kinds of practices where we use a test intended to do good, but instead it puts or places a child in a less enabling environment or acts as a barrier to something like gifted programs. So we think the misuse of IQ tests is far, far in the past. People use other kinds of tests to select into gifted programs. But in fact, the fact that some kids have had more opportunities to look good on tests than other kids have had means that we have still are creating barriers to that opportunity. So asking the opportunity question for all of these things listed is critically important. And way back in 91, I wrote this about assessment and diagnosis is a model. It comes from the medical model. The idea is we have this particular disease and we're going to come up with a cure for it. And there's supposed to be a match between our diagnostic category and the intended treatment. But instead, it is a debilitating treatment, one that categorizes and then is not effective. And very often our testing places kids into dead end programs instead of enabling, creating opportunity. So I was trying to think, and Jennifer, I took up this idea of the common good because we often use that to justify why we test. And I think that I do want my airline pilot to have passed a test about flying airplanes. So I want to acknowledge this, but we still need to think about whether we are, for a doctor, thinking about the clinical practices that connect with patients. So even in these categories with certification tests where I think we can best defend our work, we have to ask what Kronbach asked in 1980, do we need to test this? And for many things that come next in what I'm considering, the very idea of whether we need to test is something that we should be opening up to in our community. And I think that's being asked now with testing optional programming or positions on college admissions tests. So of course, we know for college placement that we can add to high school GPA in predicting graduation from college and predicting freshman GPA about 15%. That's a particular statistic I noticed recently for the SAT. And yes, it's true that the predictive correlations look about the same across groups. So each time I'm asked, I have to say, well, yes, technically they are unbiased. Technically, these tests aren't biased, at least not by the way this community that I am part of and care about, by the ways we have defined bias, these tests aren't biased, but their use can be unfair. If we know that the test is much more aligned with socioeconomic opportunity than high school GPA. And we can talk in the chat about the problems with GPA. I know grade inflation, especially high school rank can help with that. We have to face up to the fact that those tests can be barriers and that top-down selection has been overused, as was declared by a National Research Council report in the 1980s. And we're still kind of stuck there in thinking we need that extra 15%. So let's reconsider because of the gatekeeping that has been served. With respect to the accountability and classroom testing, I know this community has heard me over and over and over again. So I was like, don't just give the speech about high stakes testing and the narrowing of curriculum. But there are additional things to think about. In addition to that litany of distorting the curriculum that does have evidentiary warrant, we do know that happens. In addition, recent Spencer-funded research on DDDM, data-driven decision-making, has shown that in the pressure of high-stakes testing, when teachers are trying to work on their test scores and do something with them, the discourse becomes about the children and whom they are and why that is a negative effect, why that explains the scores rather than their teaching strategies explaining the scores. So that's a worry that we would let that discourse frame how we think about kids needing extra support. In our community, we especially have to think about how much we have created these very, very generic tests. Jennifer talked about, this claim that they're just neutral. But in fact, we make them white by taking away the meaning and context that serves purposes in community, that makes the test worthwhile. And we also have to be aware that the promises of this huge testing apparatus were to provide extra resources, to bring equity to bear if we identified which groups were doing less well. But in fact, that hasn't happened. And schools have become, over the last 20 years, since NCLB, more segregated and more unequal. The kinds of things we need to think about in classroom assessment follow in parallel to that, because children of color have been disproportionately affected by test-driven curricula. We need instead curriculum embedded assessments that are open-ended and not multiple choice. Everything that learning theory teaches us today is about local and belonging, and the things that you would teach to an indigenous group of children is not the same thing you would teach to the next group of children. Making it matter to individuals is part of what we have to do. And the more we say then we have to have uniformity, the more we're precluding that sense of purpose and recognition of self. So funds of knowledge is one of the things that our instructional practices need to respond to, that in turn what should be reflected in our assessment practices. So then to close, I'm hoping that the educational measurement community can rethink how we conceptualize fairness. It should be a little bit embarrassing, and I've written a chapter on validity, that validity did not bring into its consideration whether or not the test could be said to be valid across groups. The idea that we have cross-group validity as our definition of fairness should be troubling. Because if it doesn't work across groups, then how can we use it in most contexts? For doctoral students, I think we need to share widely the racialized history and how it is still contributing to structural racism. I hope that people will broaden their horizons so that if we get to a place where it doesn't have to just be one test, but it can be a multifaceted way of evaluating educational quality, then you want to know more about learning and you want to know more about evaluation, not just quantification, as a way to study excellence in teaching and learning. Thank you. I have to get to my other screen. This was the problem.
Thank you, Lori. And thank you, Jennifer. And I just want to say thank you for that powerful statement that you sent out earlier today about the murders of the 8 people in Atlanta. I as a member of NCME, I was glad to see you acknowledge that. And again, I'm just very proud to be a member and as part of a board too that's supporting you. So I want to just start by locating this, right? The ostensible title of this session is the near and far future of assessment. And I guess when we had our planning call, I wanted to just acknowledge that we couldn't imagine thinking about the future without thinking about this, right? About a future we would want to see, where testing is used for more equitable purposes and interpreted in ways that uphold communities that have been minoritized and excluded for the history of measurement, right? Throughout the history of measurement. And so that's why I think we're talking about this. And it's not that it should have to be defended, but it seems particularly crazy in this year with so much increasing inequality, right? And inequality that's certainly not random, right? That's being where there's particular pressure along lines of race, and gender, that we don't acknowledge this and think about this as a pivot point in the history of assessment. I'll just to give you a little bit of insight into how I've been thinking about this, right? Morgan Polikoff and I are writing this chapter on K-12 accountability and assessment. And we had started this draft like last year saying that the arc of accountability and assessment has bent towards accountability, right? And now we're like, oh, wait, hold on. Pause, right? We might have to be rewriting this, and I think everyone who's writing for EM5, everyone who's writing about assessment right now is like, wait a second, where is this going? What is this moment? And I think at the core of this, right, is this the use of assessment, right, ostensibly to increase equity, to close quote gaps, and realizing that it hasn't worked, and we keep saying it's going to work. And how many times do we have to be, Charlie Brown and the football to be like, wait a second, we don't trust this system anymore. Does it deserve our trust? How can we create a system and create a field that has earned the trust of the communities who we are trying to support? So that is what motivates this topic and the ideas that Jennifer and Lori put forth for why we're thinking about how to, take this moment in our field and bend it towards justice, right? So I'm going to be a little self-critical in this and call this speaking tisk to power, right? Which of course is a twist on this idea of speaking truth to power. And this came up in our earlier conversations where I was like, you know, a lot of times I'm on these advisory committees and I just feel like I'm saying, you know, tisk, don't do that. The standards, you know, I've got the standards right here. It's like the standards say, and I'm just tisking it. Like, what more can I be doing, right? How can measurement experts advance the causes of equity and racial justice? We've talked a little bit about quote gap reporting, and of course I've got I don't know a number of publications with the word gap in the title. I do research on large scale trends and gap reports, and here of course is one of the more famous and widely used reports from NAEP that shows gap closure over a long period of time. And then one of my students now, a professor at USC, David Quinn, and his co-authors there, talking about how just the language we use, right, affects teachers' issue prioritization, right? And if you call it an achievement gap, it becomes reified, it becomes consistent with deficit frames and reduces the prioritization because they're like, oh, well, that's always been there. There's nothing we can do about it. And so this is generally a talk about how measurement, and I'm speaking about it more, as you can see already, compared to Lori and to Jennifer at a high level where I typically do a lot of my work. I think certainly for classroom practices and assessment development, you should listen to them. And that is going to be, and I'm going to talk a little bit more at a higher level. I'm not necessarily, you can't fix the problems at a high level without attending to theirs. And so, but I'll talk a little bit about this, right? So examples first, I'm going to talk about the precious few times the tests have been modest tools for equity. I don't want to say they're never good. They have been good. They have been useful, but I think what we're arguing is that we've paid a disproportionate and unnecessary price for those useful moments. On the classroom, we talked about that all of us were going to address three issues, right? Classroom testing, selection testing, and accountability testing. On classroom testing, I'm going to say listen to Lori and Jennifer, but I'll reflect briefly on, quote, the real assessment literacy that I would hope to see. Then I'm going to talk about selection testing and ask, you know, again, we have here in Boston yet another debate, controversy around selective schools in the sort of grade 7 to 12 range, exam schools as they're called here, college admissions. Like I teach at one of the most selective institutions in higher education, you know, on why are we being selective, right? And so I'm going to talk about that and argue that we should potentially increase the role of human judgment in these processes. Then I'm going to talk about accountability testing, and here's where I think we're going to have a debate. I'm sure Lori has written an op-ed that I have mild disagreements with, and I understand where she's coming from, and usually she's right, and she may be right now. Nonetheless, I'm going to make an argument about why I favor this moment of accountability-free, resource-heavy state testing. This spring, I'm calling this a step up and stand down. Step up and stand down moment for state testing. And then I'm going to reflect briefly on how we spend our time. As you can see, this is probably going to be more than 8 minutes. I will probably save some of this for later. But I'm going to talk a little bit about teaching and learning measurement. Shout out to the special interest group for educators on measurement that I just came from their meeting. And I'm going to talk a little bit about tax, boards, and community service, and this idea in the title of my talk today about just saying tisk to power, and how I think we as a field can do better and do more. So let's dig in. First, there are times, and I'm going to be shamelessly self-citing here, that I feel that testing has made a positive difference, right? This is a list of expert reports in a Delaware case that I helped to be an advocate for, along with Hunter Gelbach, Jesse Rothstein, Bo Jackson, other great folks. This was what I said. I remember reflecting to my advisor, Ed Hartle, that, oh my gosh, I'm saying that test scores mean something. And that feels good, and that can do good, right? Usually I'm saying, you know, quibble this, quibble that. And actually, it's like, actually these mean something. And the fact that there are these disparities is something that we should be charged to do something about. And what I'm happy to see is that late last year, there was indeed a settlement that led to a large amount of money being allocated or encouraged to be allocated in Delaware. And I was proud to see this as a moment where it's like, oh yes, testing is revealing gaps and opportunities, things that schools should be doing better. Let's do better. And these are examples, again, where I think testing has made a positive difference. And other examples come from research, right? Where, for example, this educational opportunity project that I've been a part of for the past 10 years has shown the correlation between socioeconomic status and achievement at the district level in the United States and looked at how that's changed. We can see that this correlation of 0.8 is strong at the district level, but not ironclad, right? That there are these places where there are surprising levels of achievement and surprising growth over time that enable us to identify what we can do better, right? This leads to findings that I think are important, including that school funding matters, that segregation matters, that public health matters, that implicit bias matters in a negative direction, that immigration enforcement matters in a negative direction, right? So these are important findings that testing has enabled, right? That testing has enabled us to identify and then act to close disparities and to promote, I think, a more just society. Yet, and there's a yet here, the cost of the data supporting this litigation and research is massive and disproportionate. It didn't have to be that we had to test every single kid, every single grade, every single year for extended periods of time and torque the curriculum to meet that. I mean, that's a little too much, right? We could have supported this research and litigation, with a much lighter assessment footprint without accountability that risks deficit interpretations and frameworks. So I'm acknowledging that tests can do some good, but I think we are far out of balance. And I'm glad to see that the pendulum is swinging now in a direction that I think is largely appropriate. So now, as I promised, classroom assessment, selection, and then accountability. So classroom assessment, listen to Lori and Jennifer, and I mean that. This is not my area, and they are correct. I will add that we talk a lot about assessment literacy and say as a field, oh, if only they had assessment literacy, and as if reliability and standard errors of measurement would solve everything. And I guess what I would say in the context of racial justice, of interpretation, of these quote gaps and quote loss, is that the real assessment literacy is shifting from deficit to improvement interpretations of scores, right? And by that I mean that when we see a score, we do not triage, right? We act to close, right, the disparities, to do something positive about that, to improve. And this is, of course, as the research has shown, is not a simple enough statement to just say, oh yes, think about improvement, you'll be fine now. It takes massive changes and structural changes. It's not just a psychological switch you can flip. There has to be structural and lasting changes in how we interpret scores, right? And so I guess I would put it this way: without hesitation, I would sacrifice reliability and standard errors of measurement forever on the altar of assessment literacy to rid us of 1/10% of deficit score interpretations. That's what I would say, right? That's what I think of assessment literacy, right? It's not about let me teach you about my non-parametric gap statistic. It's like, how can we interpret it in a way that enables us to act, to do something about it? It's as simple as that. Third, selection testing, right? Can we increase the role of human judgment, right? So why should schools or professions be selective? Do we need exam schools? Do we need Harvard? Do we? Right? Should we be selective? Why? Why do we need to be selective? Stop and think about it. Give me an argument, right? On what basis? What is the theory by which the selectivity makes anything better, right? And I feel like a lot of us don't go back to that first principle. We always forget the theory of action. We always forget, intended purposes and uses and why it matters, right? We always forget standard 1.1, right? It's easy to forget. So once we have answered that question, hopefully to our satisfaction, including potentially saying sometimes maybe we don't need to be so selective. Why? Then we can proceed to ask on what basis. I find that debates over algorithms, right? Should we set the cut score at the 60th percentile and then randomize, right? Should we take, do we weight ELA this much and math this much and high school grades this much, right? I find those are rarely productive and reduce to zero-sum quibbles that oppose falsely, right, rigor on the one side and diversity on the other. And I wonder if a greater embrace of human judgment, and here's where I'm saying maybe we should look to standards. No, I'm not going so far, but this idea that there's an authority in human judgment and committees acting with authority and due process can achieve this perfect combination of excellence and equity, only when you have an argument that you actually need to be selective at all. And this is going to increase the cost substantially, but I believe it might be worth it. Number 4, an equity argument for testing this spring. And so here's where, as always, we're getting current. And again, where I think there is likely to be some disagreement among all of us on this Zoom call right now. So I've, as many of you know, I've written an essay about how we can, a technical memo about how we can support interpretable metrics this spring in spite of massive losses of test scores and the likelihood that many people will opt out. So I have 7 recommendations that I've written up in a draft essay that I'm happy to share maybe, I don't know, tomorrow or something after you tear it apart and I realize I have to revise everything. I'll cite Laurie and Jennifer when I'm like, oh, I should have rethought this. Here are 7 steps for state tests to, as I've said, step up and stand down. Number 1, take the administration's invitation to waive accountability. Number 2, take the administration's invitation to waive the mandatory 95% participation adjustment. In other words, no accountability, no mandate. If people want to opt out, opt out. If you're feeling stressed, opt out. If you're feeling that this is inequitable, opt out. That is fine. My metrics will accommodate that. Offer test this spring to enable comparability to spring 2019. Use the 3 metrics I recommend. Many of you have seen this, and I'm happy to describe them further. But this will help to monitor learning and allocate support. Bring all data on deck. All data on deck. Is that mixing metaphors too much? All data on deck for a complete, quote, educational census. Number 6, allocate this unprecedented funding. Hundreds of billions of dollars. Historic. Never before have we had this sudden influx of federal funding. Absolutely unprecedented. Shouldn't we try to figure out where our needs have grown greatest? Right. So where can these equity indicators in this educational census, where do they suggest there is greatest need? I think this is, again, time for state testing to step up and stand down. 7th, commit that no 2020-2021 data shall be used for future high stakes accountability. Defer high stakes accountability indices until at least next year as a baseline. I would like you to defer it further if you can, please. That's my 7-step argument. And again, why can we say this and how does this relate to equity and social justice and racial justice? It's like for too long, we've had accountability and no support. Now it's the opposite. It's the opposite. We have no accountability and a massive historic amount of support. Holy smokes. This is what we've been asking for. It's time for state tests to step up and stand down. Finally, if I can find my cursor, a little reflection on teaching and learning educational measurement. So first, in addition to the history and practices that Laurie and Jennifer described, we should also teach and help students learn accurate interpretations and reporting of socio-demographic data. Let's avoid deficit framings and commit to reducing them. So use active voice. That's the first thing. Whenever I look at the standards, I'm like, couldn't you have used active voice? Who should be doing these things? Name them. Right. So also my go-to reference for this is Juberi. I talk about this in my class. Right. So I'm not going to read all of this. I'm already over time. But the major error is in how race has been interpreted. It's a very thoughtful argument. When we discuss, quote, the effect of race, we are less mindful of the larger world in which the path to success or failure is routinely influenced by other contingencies or circumstances. The causal factors in statistical racism are discriminatory practices by employers, not the races of the people involved. The causal factors in environmental racism are discriminatory practices by institutions in determining the location of hazardous waste sites. Be specific, right? Don't just say, and I love this example because all of you, especially teachers of measurement, have heard this before, right? It's like, this is a straw person kind of argument here, right? Controlling for background by using this statistic, a small reduction in the quote, black coefficient, right? It's like a unit increase in gender predicts a beta. I mean, are you joking me? Like, think about what you're doing. Be accurate and specific in your interpretations and don't reify these variables because there are human beings behind them. Finally, I want to reflect briefly on the tisk that I mentioned before, right? I'm privileged to serve on many technical advisory committees. We do important work, but there are times we're bound by policy. I see many of you in the room today who are on these kinds of committees. So we make the best of a bad situation. We speak only tisk to power. So I am recommending a few things. First, that TAC should take stronger stances where appropriate, make statements and vote to approve them, send minutes and statements to commissioners and state board members. TAC should also rotate more often than they do to enable the next generation generation to give their advice. These are well-paid positions, and I'm going to start to turn more of them down because I think we need to again, enable the next generation, the people who have been affected by these accountability policies more than we have growing up should be speaking to how to improve them. TACs should also open themselves up to measurement students who have signed NDAs, and my students know that I've done this. I want to talk about the contrast now between TACs and governing boards, and many of you know that I am proud of my time on the National Assessment Governing Board, quote, protecting trend, and stating that, you know, we never satisfied standard 1.1 until, you know, Greg Sisek and I got together and we're like, we should really do this. So now there is an intended meaning of NAEP results and we're proud of it. But it took me too long to realize I was governing, not advising. I was very young when I started on NAGB and I just really didn't know what I was doing. And I was like, oh my goodness, I have a chance to govern, not just advise. I missed an opportunity, for example, to ask whether NAEP achievement gap reporting was too complicit in deficit narratives or advocate for more channels to advocacy groups. So here's where I was thinking, it's like, oh my goodness, I need to take a stand when I'm in the authority and position to do so. And finally, this is again, a lot of I statements here. I just hope to spend less time speaking to SISTA power and more time supporting assessment efforts in local community organizations where the change is happening. This is me reflecting on my own time. I hope you all reflect on your own time and try to find a way to, again, bend this curve, right? Instead of speaking to power, I hope that all of us as a field can not just reinforce the structures and systems that exist, but work actively to change them, which sometimes requires more in our choice of what we do with our time and how we teach what we do and how we learn what we do. It requires us to do more than speaking to power. So that's where I'll close. I look forward to the discussion. It is sure to be interesting. Thank you for your time.
All right. Wow, this is, I know we're going to be in for a treat with some really powerful statements and lots of encouragement, so to speak, to think about the future of assessments. Trying to share my screen here. You should be able to see my screen over here. And I have a couple of questions put in, but as always, please feel free to put in the questions in the chats and we will try to get them. I'll monitor and try to facilitate. But since I am the facilitator and I get to ask questions, I wanted, and I'm a practitioner, I do a lot of work in the licensing field as well. All the three panelists have talked about, under the umbrella of equity and social justice, assessments futures for accountability, classroom, and selection. So selection kind of goes with the licensing field, but not quite. I wanted to kind of focus us a little bit and see from the panelist perspective, what measurement professionals can do within the framework we have now to really advance their work under the umbrella of trying to continue down our road of equity and racial justice. Who wants to go first? Any volunteers before I start shouting at people?
You should call on us, Yi. We'll take turns.
Lori, please.
Well, I think that we have a lot to learn, even in this moment. I don't think we've done enough research in the certification area where I'm willing to say, we need something, we have to have a test. Then it's our responsibility to examine more closely with more investment than we have in whether when it occurs that candidates have a diploma and can't pass the test. I don't think that we have enough evidence about that, because the fact that they have a diploma may mean that they are qualified. And so I think just pursuing that as a question, trying to describe empirically what it is that explains why we have candidates who got a diploma, who are said to be qualified and then could not pass the test. And in some cases, currently, there are people being admitted into into professional circles that normally would have required a test, but they couldn't take a test this year. So it is an opportunity for people to pursue that and see if diplomas alone would be sufficient. Then what does that tell us about our tests?
That's a great point, Laurie. And just for the record, right, for psychometricians, we've had this debate in the past. Do we want certifications for psychometricians? We of all people, where we're measurement professionals, we don't really have a licensing track for psychometricians. We decide if you're finish your doctoral degree, then you're good to go to practice in the field. But then with licensure certification, we also have, for example, the IT field, where you wanted to take courses and be a licensing to be able to practice in particular crowd products, for example, or in like regulatory markets where you think about real estate and markets like that. But anyway, I'm gonna go to Andrew for your comment on this.
Sure. The first thing I'd say is that I am not a licensure and certification testing expert. And one of the things that's become clear in my 3 years on the board is how wonderful a licensure and certification testing community we have in NCME, and how sometimes we talk past them. And so I don't want to do them any injustice by assuming that I know anything about this topic and overstating my qualifications. But it's something, again, this is intended, as you know, as more of an academic panel for graduate students to sort of think about what scholars and those in the academy are thinking about in the near and far future. But I do want to give this wonderful group a shout out and say that I've enjoyed their presentations earlier throughout this COVID webinar series. I'll also say, just to look back a little bit at the selection argument I was making earlier, why do we need to be selective? Now, I think for many professions, it's sort of obvious, but we should still remind ourselves of why it's important, and then be clear about the skills that are necessary. Just as a personal anecdote, again, this isn't my field, but I started doing an oral exam. I actually call it the conversational celebration of learning. It's rebranding is important. But I do an oral exam in my measurement class, and it's one of those things where it's like, what is reliability? Tell me. If I tell you it's 0.9, what does 0.9 mean? Tell me now, right? It's like you're like, what? And it's like, well, if you give me some time, I can look back at my textbook, right? And it's one of those things where it's like, it forced, so first there's that, it's like a different mode. Second, it forced everyone to study differently, right? Instead of looking at this and memorizing this, they were like, oh, maybe we should have conversations with each other where we talk about what reliability is and why it matters, what a standard error is and why it matters. Why does equating matter? Right. And they had conversations with each other where they didn't before. So this is the power, right? And I know certification exams, some of them have very, very rich performance tasks, right? It gets folks to study differently. And that's an incredible power. Now, someone already raised in the chat, what is the cost of all this? Not to mention what I was proposing, which is to bring in more human judgment and have a much more adjudication of multiple measures. Incredibly costly. Put your money where your mouth is. You care about diversity and equity and justice? Pay for it. Pay for it, right? Because we want a richer set of measures. We don't just want people going to the books. That's not what the real world of practice is like. It's going to get more expensive. Fine. That's the price we pay for an appropriate, fair assessment. And so I would like to see it, and I'd love the cost benefit, that we should get specific about it. But that's my limited perspective on this topic, and I look forward to engaging with the licensure and certification testing community more about this. We have wonderful experts in this field.
Thank you, Andrew, and appreciate the shout out to the many practitioners in the licensing field too. Jennifer, I'm going to go to you, but there's also specific questions calling out for you too around, if you could talk a little bit about, in the context of licensing field, what's the importance around having people at the table, especially from a diversity perspective?
Oh, great. Happy to talk about that. First, I want to echo everything you said, Andrew. First, with I'm not a licensure certification person, not even a good facsimile of one. So, listen to others, and Laurie, take everything I say with a grain of salt. But I couldn't agree with you more around the yeah, let's start paying for some stuff to get some better measures out there. One thing I do want to address this directly in terms of what we can do as measurement professionals, is I start to think about the literature and this movement towards assessment for learning, and us as a field making our assessments more meaningful so that they do something more than just irritate people, right? And so I think when we're talking about licensure and certification exams, obviously when we're talking about medical people, I do want to know that my doctor, knows the difference between a kidney and a liver. That's very important to me. I understand the need to assess for that. But I also think we could use assessments, if we're thinking about anti-racist assessment, we could use those assessments to force our doctors to be anti-racist, right? If we, as measurement professionals and test developers stood up and said, okay, on this assessment, we need at least 15% of it to be explicitly anti-racist, where we push back against stereotypes around Black and brown individuals, that we make sure that our doctors are at that place, then they would be forced to study and to learn from an anti-racist perspective. And then that assessment becomes about changing actually something, right? And I feel like this is something we could advocate and we could do on these texts that so many people serve on. How are you actually making your assessment anti-racist? And how is that assessment then changing practice in medical schools, in airline schools, in teacher schools? And in terms of thinking about representation, I think representation is critical. It's really important at all of these tables that Black and brown individuals be there. We know from critical race theory that people sharing their own stories, their narratives, their counter narratives are critical in terms of changing the way people think about these minoritized communities. I also have said and will continue to say that many of the people that are at these tables are Black and brown people who have mastered whiteness, who grew up in the same colonial educational systems as whiteness, as their white peers sitting at those tables. And so it's critical for us as a profession to raise our critical consciousness as a whole. So not just white professionals or Asian professionals, but also Black and Hispanic and Indigenous professionals to really understand what white hegemony looks like, what white supremacy looks like in our assessments, and pulling that out. Yeah, has heard this story from John Twing, and he told me I could steal it, so I'm going to. And the end of it is there was a big brouhaha around an assessment being biased. The Black and brown community was very upset. They were in a meeting. The retort from the test developers was, but we had Black and brown people on our sensitivity reviews. That was the response. Your people were sitting at the table reviewing these items. And one woman stood up, Black woman, and said, I can't help it if all your Black people are white. And to me, I think that speaks to what I'm talking about. It has to be a critical consciousness raising across the field with respect to representation. So Black and brown people at the table, of course, but let's just make sure that we all understand the history of measurement and the history of white supremacy and measurement.
Thank you. I think just us to be able to open to have these conversations and really think deeply about what we can do as measurement professionals. It's really good to align with the CMU mission, but also really good to do what we claim we do. Anyway, I'm gonna go to the next question where I think each panelist has talked a little bit about this already, about how graduate students really can engage with these different issues as they go through their graduate programs, as well as trying to think about what they would want to do in the future, whether they want to practice the measurement in the industry or when they want to go into the academia. I'm gonna go to Andrew first and see what additional thoughts you would want to share.
Yeah, this is sort of on the faculty more than the students. It's our job. So this is something, again, I just came from the Educators of Measurement special interest group. And this is, I think, part of what we have to discuss there. And again, all the faculty members in the room and all the practitioners who hope to hire our graduates in the future, I hope we'll talk about it. And it would be great to have some sort of consensus set of materials or consensus approaches. I'll tell you that it was just last week that I talked about interpretation of sociodemographic variables and just getting that conversation out there and not just having it as like diversity day, right, where we talk about it, but having it be a through line throughout the entire course, where it's like, no, what the research we do is all about aggregate policy-oriented statistics. So anytime you're engaging with a sociodemographic group, your skills have to become sharper and sharper every time you write about this. You have to see the human beings in your data, right, and acknowledge them and know that you might not be able to know everything about them, so don't say everything about them, right, and know the process that generates the data, which is just the old standby, but that includes acknowledging the humanity and personhood of the people that whose data you are summarizing. So I think it's on us. I will say that there's a really interesting item in our course evaluations, which says, I can't remember exactly what the wording was, but it was like, to what extent does this instructor, meet the diversity goals, in their learning, in their course. And in my statistics class, right, the modal response was not applicable, not applicable, right? And so I took this as historical, right? I took that as like a sign of a colossal failure. Like that, I mean, not applicable is worse than a 1, right? Like I'd rather have a 1 than you leaving with a not applicable, because that's immediate evidence that failed, right? Like if you don't think it's applicable, then we're in trouble, right? And so that's what I mean is like, we got to, again, I don't care if you're a 1, but don't be not applicable. I mean, I do care if you're a 1, we should get better, but not applicable is worse than a 1, right? That's worse. So that's just a reflection on how important this is, and it's on us, right? Not just the graduate students to engage.
I am glad to hear that's on the professors and not on the students, but thank you, Andrew. Jennifer, I'm going to go to you next.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I think we have to really start to redesign our courses in a way that speak to justice throughout, which is not an easy task. So remember that, graduate students. And when we engage in it, we fall down. I've adjusted my stats class and fallen down a couple of times because dealing with these issues can be difficult. I will say what graduate students can do, I'm not just going to put it all on us, is, you're all at universities. Take a class with someone who's not a measurement person that deals with issues around social justice. There are classes on critical race theory, there are classes on queer theory, there are classes on social justice issues. There are all manner of diversity and inclusion courses that you can take that can inform how you approach measurement. And I would say take them sooner rather than later. Don't take all your measurement courses and then take your diversity and inclusion and social justice courses at the end. I would say right up at the beginning, so that as you're in Andrew's course, my course, Steve Cerisi's courses, you are thinking about what this looks like, this measurement piece from a social justice perspective. That would be my absolute recommendation. Beyond that, I would say every measurement program should require students to take a course that has some social justice lens to it, even if it's not a course that we teach in our programs, and we probably shouldn't be the ones teaching the course. But I think if we really want this to happen, then we have to make students take the courses so that it happens.
That's a great point, Jennifer. And I see some echoing from the chats as well. Lori, I'm going to go to you next.
Well, I think just to bring all these things into a shared understanding, one thing I had on my slides was this idea that everyone should take an up-to-date learning course or an up-to-date understanding of how much perspective matters. In Jennifer's example of, I could take these other courses and I could see if I have a standpoint in this positionality, I see the world in a certain way, and to have the metacognitive awareness to then step into another worldview, being able to recognize the worldview that is inherent in our traditional measurement, very objective ways of thinking. That's what's at issue here, is to recognize that set of assumptions that become invisible, and understanding them will let you be more aware then of how to open that up. I noticed a comment in the chat earlier about that non-standardized measures don't necessarily benefit groups of color. It's not the non-standardization that matters. It's the local meaningfulness that matter. And the problem with our testing regimes is that they try to make things uniform over broad communities. And then that advantages those groups that are comfortable with that whiteness and disadvantages the groups that cannot see themselves in that universal. So it's not just an argument about standardization. The standardization that we experience is so uniform. And that's what makes it off-putting to some participants. So we just have to learn about those perspectives and step in and out of those different viewpoints so that we'll be more adept at seeing how they affect so much of what we do.
Yeah, it's almost like a construct, fairness and construct together, validity together issue. That's a great clarification, Laurie. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that one. Going on to the next slide. Now, we also have people who are in the fields and they have really advocated for our fields, whether they're in academia trying to teach and train future measurement experts, or if they're in the industry like myself included, we're trying to do the best we can to practice in the fields. What are the advice our panelists have for the professionals who are already in the fields, thinking about equity, racial justice, but also how we move ahead with the future for assessments? Jennifer, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, for me, I think my response is pretty simple. It's been helpful to actually collaborate and work with people who do work around equity and racial justice almost exclusively. Some of them, of course, within the context of very specific subjects or content, right? So there are people who do it exclusively within writing, and people who do it exclusively within math instruction, et cetera. And some who do it broadly. And for me, in my own professional development around issues of equity and racial justice, that has been the key, is to identify those people that are doing that work and just say, hey, can we talk? Can we work together? Can we have a project together? Can we write a grant together? And it's been helpful for me and in framing my thinking, because again, whiteness tends to be the default. And these individuals, both Black and brown and white allies, have been pushing back against this for a long time. So they've been really helpful in allowing me to see all those holes in my understanding and perceptions about what assessment is and what assessment does to students. So that would be my recommendation, is find a friend.
Find a friend and phone a friend. Awesome. Laurie, I'm going to go to you next.
Well, I don't want to say the same things over and over again. I think that Jennifer's right, that it takes perspective to re-examine the ways in which each one of our, we must test, here's what the test has to look like, here's what its consequences are. There's a narrative now, and I think we haven't asked all the right questions, and those ought to be re-asked when we look at the impacts of testing. So in each application, there's a set of circumstance, and we have to ask again to what extent we're creating barriers.
Yeah, so in the industry, in our practices, there have been some critical questions people are thinking about. So yes, we do bias and sensitivity reviews in our item development, in our form reviews. We also do all these wonderful statistics with diff that we do, and all the sensitivity and the bias review that built into the process. But these are all good things to do, but are they good enough? And I think Jennifer, Lori, and Andrew, your guys are providing some really good, inspiring thoughts today. Andrew, I'm gonna go to you next.
Yeah, this is tricky. I was trying to figure out if I should put this in my slides, but like, we should probably acknowledge that the incentives in both academia and in testing organizations are dead set against doing this. So we should just say that. so there's this, a strange protection that comes with tenure, and I think I would say a responsibility that comes with tenure to sort of say, okay, let's do right by all the time that I spent just calculating the next best gap statistic, and maybe do something about how to improve that, improve interpretation of that in a way that avoids deficit mindsets, or decompose the system a little bit to make us less reliant on such statistics, right? And more accommodating of multiple measures, right? So these are the kinds of things I think about now, right? Some few years out of tenure, where I'm like, what is my responsibility to this country and to these communities and to my communities too, where we don't just want to be seen as a test score, we'd love to be seen as a human being first, before any assumptions you might make about how about what my test scores might be because of how I look. And so this is just sort of a me statement again about, I think that, again, the responsibility of all of us in academia and professionals, again, to push to find support within your organizations, to build a constituency that those in power cannot ignore. And representation certainly matters, but so does advocacy and alliances at local levels, which is what I think we should be paying more attention to. Certainly, we all have these experiences of being, the token person on the diversity committee, and I guess that and just trying again to advocate for more representation and more power, and it's on us who are in positions of power in this field for whatever reason to step up and do something with that, and not just get comfortable sitting on our laurels and collecting our checks.
I think I should jump back in just because I was hemming and hawing before, because I thought I had put on the slide. I think we have to face as a profession that the largeness of the field, the testing industry, is going to have to shrink or redirect if our strongest criticisms are listened to. So it feels awkward, like we're just being really polite about that. That's a hard thing, that if uniformity is argued against by sociocultural learning practices that say, pay attention to the community, pay attention to the individual, make it meaningful, then bringing in a product that is uniform across the nation works against that kind of curriculum. So do state level standardized tests work against curricula, which we are not building thoughtfully in this country. We do not invest in curriculum development. So I guess I should have said, every one of the major companies should redirect their investments, diversify, and start looking at partnerships with people who are deep content experts, and build open-ended, not multiple choice curriculum products. So I mean, there's a direction we could go as a field, but it's not who we are. So that's a problem for NCME to lead that effort?
That's a fascinating point, Lori. And I see some agreement in the chat, like we as a field have to evolve. Otherwise, we're going to be out of the picture. And we are in a good position to be able to think about all these different factors, all these different issues, and then think about how we as professionals can really help. And there always are different points of view, different perspectives. And I think that's what our webinars are for, really just to share all these different thoughts and get us thinking as a field what our next steps really need to be, and maybe not uniform for the entire field either, right? So it's good to have these conversations. So I appreciate the perspectives. My next question is about the standards. So as many of you probably have seen from NCME's press release, together with ARA and APA, the 2014 standards were finally made open source and accessible to people free of charge. It's in an ebook format or PDF, however you want to download. So that's really huge an improvement, especially if we want to encourage good practices in measurement in the field. This is almost the least we could do. But at the same time, that standards from 2014, and we will be looking at the next standards fairly quickly. And I do want to call out, there is a call for nomination, self-nomination out in the field. It was released last week. We are looking for the next member to represent NCME in the joint management committee with ARA and APA, and the committee will be overseeing the development of the next standards. This is a very important role for NCME. So if anyone of you is interested, you should definitely send your cover letter and email and CV to the email address listed in that announcement. So, but my question over here is to ask our panelists to share some thoughts around what role the next edition of the standards should play. Now, if we're thinking about uniform standards or not uniform standards, I would be curious to hear the different thoughts from our panelists around what role the next edition should play in advancing equity and racial justice. And Lori, I'm gonna start with you.
Well, we actually played a little bit with this idea in our preliminary conversation. And I think that those of you convene to think of the next generation of the standards. They are a framing document for the profession. So I don't mean that it has to be different for different contexts. That can be uniform, but it ought to ask the question about fairness versus validity. I think it's odd that we have a chapter about validity and a separate chapter about fairness, because, especially since the methods that are called out in the fairness chapter have to do with whether or not tests are valid across groups. And how could you have a valid test that was only valid for the white majority group? That's a historic artifact that we didn't start asking those questions about fairness represented by predictive correlations, for example, until the 1980s. And so that was tacked on. And I think just as with everything else we're doing, we have to re-examine, open it up, and ask now, if we were starting to make a set of professional standards, what would we focus on? How would we conceive it?
Thank you. I'm gonna go to Jennifer next.
I've actually been thinking about this a little bit. Not that I want to spend the next 10 years of my life writing the standards. Let me be very clear about that. But you know, I have been going through the standards, and actually Kristen and I are working on a paper together. And basically, I'll tell you the truth, I went through the standards and I was like, yeah, this is racist. This is racist. That's so racist. The next edition of the standards, someone needs to do that. Someone needs to go through every standard, every paragraph, and identify what's racist here. And more importantly, inject some anti-racism, right? So every standard should be viewed from an anti-racist lens. What will be the outcome of this standard? Who is being ignored when you say the test we should have constructive relevance is basically taking out all possible context, right? Who is being privileged when you do that? Who is being harmed when you make statements like that? By the way, people, for the record, that's racist. So that's where I feel like the next edition of the standard, someone needs to be at that table who is critical, who's been thinking about issues of racial justice, and not just one person at that table. When I say someone, it needs to be a table full of people who are committed to equity and racial justice and making sure that the standards reflect that at every level.
Very, very well said. Jennifer will be one of our on the review panel to help us select the next member that goes into the management committee that will oversee this. So I think at least that's one of the criteria you're going to ask the candidate who wants to serve this important role for NCME. Andrew, I'm going to go to you next.
Yeah, this is interesting. I mean, I was just flipping through, I feel like I've been advertising for it, but it's free now. So it's not really an ad, right? It's like it's sort of a promotion for like accessing this free material. Reports of group differences in test performance should be accompanied by relevant contextual information, but that just seems entirely unsatisfactory. So, one thing I noticed about the APA style manual, which has these guidelines for bias-free language. And again, it's not just about recognizing people's humanity, although that should be sufficient. It's also about accuracy. It's about accurate interpretation, right? And so there's something interesting. I feel like there's the arbitrary disconnect between validation and fairness is sometimes to do with aggregate statistics, right? It's like validity. We're still so obsessed with individual scores and psychometrics, right? And that we don't go up a level and think about fairness for different groups. It's sort of that individual aggregate tension. There's a lot more there. That's a very casual distinction. But I do think that there's something there, and that something like the style guide is interesting. What's interesting about the style guide too is that it's online, right? So they can change it because it's gonna keep changing, right? Just like science advances, so too does language. And so there's this really nice way that APA is sort of effectively acknowledged, right? We better keep this updated because this is gonna really not age well because people change and the world evolves, right? And so there's a practice of staying current, right, with the way that people's identities are and the way people consider themselves and their identities. And I made the mistake recently for a Harvard survey of like going back 3 years and using a previously approved survey and then releasing that, and everyone saying, whoa, this is not what we call ourselves anymore. And I'm like, oh, right, this changes that fast. This 2014 to 2021 is a neon. I mean, it's far too long to wait to update these sorts of things. So I do think that there's, this is all the more reason why we have to have like a science of staying current with this, not just a science that, the best practice is to update the best practices, right? So that's just a reflection, and that how little attention there is paid really to aggregate metrics, right? I think it's all long been a blind spot in our work. And the more we as a field can sort of step back, listen to incorporate some more of the sociologist perspective and think not just about psychometrics, but what Steve Raudenbush and Sean and others have sort of ecometrics, right? This idea, right? It's like, let's think about the system of equity indicators, right? And leverage some of that knowledge and bring some of our psychometric tools to bear on context, right? An opportunity to learn, not just at an individual level, but at an aggregate level. And that's, I think, a real opportunity for the graduate students out there. I think that blend of fields and disciplines is really powerful and important, and something to invest in. And I hope we can have something like that in our standards, where we talk about the interpretation, not just of individual scores, but aggregate scores, because that seems to be to where fairness comes in.
Yeah, the aggregate scores, so you're pinpoint. But one of the things the committee has been talking about, the standards committee has been talking about, is we have the standards, but do we want to have those ancillary materials for the users, the end users, to interpret some of the standards for them, et cetera, et cetera. So fascinating ideas. Well, we're almost out of time, but the last question, so maybe I'll just give like a quick sentence or two from each of the panelists. Since this is a webinar about COVID's impact on assessments, what has COVID taught us about the issues around equity and racial justice? and then what we might do in its aftermath. I'm going to go with Lori first.
I think you just muted yourself, Laura.
You muted yourself, Laura.
How did I do that? I didn't touch anything.
It was my mistake. I was going to mute myself and then muted you.
I see. So I think that every time we make an equity claim with tests, we should not test again until we've actually spent the money to address. So that's a slight overstatement, because it would actually be good if within a decade that we claimed we were going to resolve an ill and make things more equitable, we wouldn't test again. I just think that we have to get the balance back between the data collection and the claims of how we're going to use the data for equity.
Great. Jennifer?
I'll say quickly that I think COVID has taught us that there are so many hidden disparities and inequities and injustices that we have no idea even exist in society, broadly speaking, but also in our schools. And we really have to do a better job of interrogating and investigating those inequities.
Well put. Andrew?
Yeah, you know, we're this old-fashioned science of individual differences, and it's one of those it's one of those opportunities to again reclaim some of these old statistics as tools for justice. It's not as easy as flipping a switch and taking an improvement mindset instead of a deficit mindset, but I believe we have to do it. Otherwise, what good are we doing, right? And so, again, to me, this past year has all been about like power and inequality, right? And the power differential just reinforcing the inequalities we see, and it's been evident in everything from health to education and back, and so I just hope we can be part of the solution, and that does require good science, and part of good science is good interpretation, and that's where I think we as a field can do a lot to improve. And with that, I'm looking forward to raising a glass and getting more specific.
Yeah, thank you. This has been a fascinating session, and I'm seeing a lot of exciting chats.
You muted
Someone else
yourself.
muted you.
There we go.
I want to say this has been a really fascinating session, and I think we're talking about some topics that can be very comfortable to all of us, but I appreciate all the candidacy from all the panelists, and also the beautiful chats we're seeing. Lots and lots of chats we're seeing in this third dimension of our presentations. So it's about a little over 5. We're going to have our happy hour starting about 5:15 Eastern time. If you have the time and can spare, please do join us. We're going to break people into smaller groups and be able to have some more interactions with folks. And our panelists, all of them have pledged to stay on. We also have our planning committee, Mary Ann, Ellen, and Susan are going to sit down as well. And so we'll have an opportunity to interact as well. So come back at 5:15 if you can. All right. And thank you to all of our panelists.
Yeah, just really quickly, should we stay on? Also, like what do I have to do? So